Hey everybody, welcome to the Fired Up with CJ show. We have Nicholas Pearson and we were talking about his book, The Stone of the Goddess Crystals for the Divine Feminine. So welcome, Nicholas.
Thanks for having me.
So we had you on the first segment talking about why crystals or why you go into stores and people are hanging crystals for energy and how the energy is actually created by a crystal. And we were also talking about different things that people use like rocks, crystals, minerals, and what the differences are. Now I wanted in this segment to talk about buying crystals. There's so many crystals out
Mm.
there. They all look different. I kind of never know exactly what I'm doing there. And I mean, I'm kind of like more just like you said, like attracted to in the previous segment, attracted to maybe a color or the supposed function of the stone that has been written on a little descriptor in a store. But I wanted to go into, in your book, you talk about four primary functions of a crystal: oscillators, harmonizers, prisms, translators, and recorders. And I assume that that would probably influence my buying decision on which crystal I'd buy. Can you tell me about what those even things mean, the functions of crystals, and how that would impact what I was looking for?
Sure. And so those five primary features are shared by all crystalline materials.
Okay.
So whether that's the biological crystals in our body, whether it is the liquid crystal in the form of water that we drink, or the beautiful rocks and minerals that we take home to use in our healing practice.
Hmm.
So first and foremost, they are harmonizers. That means that they can introduce a more coherent state of being, a more harmonized state of being to an extant energy field. So that's why when we bring that crystal into our field, it teaches us how to be more crystalline. A
Mm.
side effect of this is that they also tend to amplify things because a coherent message sort of has a louder signal, if you will. The message is carried further. So that's why we experience that sort of amplification effect with crystals. They are oscillators, which means that they vibrate at very specific frequencies to both send and receive signals. Think of them as almost like antennas
Mm.
that can process certain wavelengths of energy or information.
Mm.
Even the antennas that are in our cell phones these days are inspired by crystals. They're called fractal antennas. And so it's
Mm.
got this sort of regular, repeated geometric structure out of which it's made.
Mhm.
That's why our modern cell phones are so tiny. They take about as much space as our thumbnail instead of being those big honking antennas we used to have on the outside of our cell
Yes.
phones.
Yeah.
Um, Curiously enough, fractal antennas are also the only ones that can effectively send and receive information on more than one wavelength at the same time. So we can
Interesting.
posit that crystals in this sense can do the same thing.
Right.
Um, Crystals are also good at translating information. So we would call this transduction. If we look in the sort of physical side of things with quartz, for an example, it's got a property called piezoelectricity. So
Hmm.
if we take quartz crystal and using more force than human fingers could generate, but we squeezed its crystal lattice and put it under great stress, it would generate an electrical charge.
Hmm.
In reverse, if we add an electrical charge to a little sliver of quartz, like we might find in our watches or our clocks on the wall, that little tiny sliver of quartz begins to vibrate at very precise intervals.
Hmm.
And our timepieces actually measure, they count the number of oscillations, the number of vibrations that electrical charge generates. And that's how we know 1 second, 1 minute, or an hour has passed.
Hmm.
So they work to translate between one state of being and another. So they can translate our internal dialogue into the language that the universe speaks.
Hmm.
And they become that sort of intermediary in that regards.
Hmm.
Um, Also, we have them as these great optical tools. I mentioned earlier that they're great reflectors, but they're
Hmm.
also refractors. They're prisms and lenses,
Hmm.
so they can magnify and redirect and enhance the focus of the mind, the body, the spirit, and
Hmm.
they can also reflect to us maybe the things that we're less than conscious of. So
Hmm.
that's how they can have this really profound personal relationship with us. And finally, they're recorders. They have memory. The
Wow.
structure of a crystal's lattice enables it to sort of retain an echo or an imprint of an electromagnetic field with which it's come into contact. So that's how we can maybe charge or program our stones to carry out a specific function or task in our lives.
Hmm.
That's also why we can, pick up a piece of stone from a sacred space, or climb a mountain, or hold, an antique brooch and feel this sort of inertia of the past there. We sense something greater than just that moment we're in there. And that's because the crystal lattice has memory.
Wow. Okay, so this is for crystals. And so crystals, as you're saying, are very specific types of stones that have solid, regular repeating patterns. And
Yeah.
so, like, how do I know what if something's a crystal or not? Does it look a specific way, or how would I know if something's a crystal or not?
So by the time we're buying things in stores, let's back up and say that although that is the definition of a crystal, all minerals are crystals and all rocks are made of minerals. So
Okay.
most of the things we mentioned earlier are going to be crystalline in one way or the other,
Okay.
except for the things that kind of exist outside of that category. And they'd be things like forms of natural glass, like obsidian,
Hmm.
amorphous materials like opal or amber. The number of things without a crystal structure are far less numerous than those that do have a crystal structure. And even those that don't have a good and fully formed crystal lattice often have what we call short range order and will have crystalline or quasi-crystalline components.
Hmm.
So we can still apply a lot of those same principles to things that are not a crystal or a mineral in the classical sense.
Okay, got it.
Um,
So by the time I go to a store, aside from the few that you have on the list, obsidian, opal, amber as examples, most of the things are going to be crystals, it sounds like.
right.
Okay. And then there's and this is so confusing when you go to the store. So you'll see these are examples of rough stones that you have in your book. So here's an example of something that I have. It's
Hmm.
rough, right? It's not
Yeah.
it's not polished like this one is a polished one. So you have rough ones, you have tumbled ones, you have ones like this that have a point on it. You
Hmm.
have some that are obelisk, which I don't have, but it would be like a very big. You have those in the back, if I noticed in your bookshelf.
Yes.
Um, you have double turmalline crystals where they're like pointy on both ends, like this. So it's like pointy. I don't. These crystals are kind of embarrassing. I'm sure you have much more beautiful ones, but
No worries.
they're pointed on both sides. You have clusters like this one, like I showed before, is kind of like I don't even know what this is. I like it's a cluster of things. Like this one, clear. It's like lots of different things
Hmm.
layered on top of it. Um, you have geodes, which I'm sure I see them in the back. You have, and then you have like spheres where they take those stones and turn them into circles. They make them into eggs. They make them into wands. I actually have a crystalline bowl that I forgot to bring down here, but I have a
Oh,
bowl
beautiful.
that's made out of crystal. Um, there's jewelries like I have right now, like all these different pendants and little amulets. There's all these different kinds of things out there, which as someone who's a novice, it can be kind of confusing to see. Like, okay, I've heard, I am. You've sold me, Nicholas. Like, you've sold me on the merits of crystals and that they have all these wonderful properties and they have an energetic quality. How do I know which of these things to buy? And does it matter?
Yes and no. And, I think the absolute bottom line is start with what you're attracted to, whether that is a
Okay.
humble little polished stone or a little crystal point, or if you have it in your budget to get, something that is beautiful and as large as you are, go for it.
Right.
But I think that the most important thing is to start with where you're called. So
Hmm.
when we walk into a metaphysical store or a rock shop or an expo or something, and we find a source of crystals in our lives, it can be overwhelming to look at the sheer variety,
Yes.
the the information that we see represented on the cards and things can make it feel like you need one of everything.
Right.
Because couldn't we just benefit by having every crystal
Yeah.
ever? And sure, we could, but we have to remember several things. One, we can't reduce a crystal's entire life story to a little tiny placard that's going to sit beside it in a basket on a store shelf.
Right.
There's so much more we could say about it. So we might be strongly attracted to a crystal, read the description, and say, "Oh, well, none of this applies to my life, so I must not need this." Or
Mm.
conversely, we could find another stone whose description sounds exactly like what we need, but we feel no attraction to it whatsoever.
Mm.
So start with what you feel some sort of connection to. It might be the way it looks. It might be the tactile sense of it when you hold it. It might be this sort of inner knowing, this magnetic sensation. Some people close their eyes and see colors. Some people have internal dialogues with their stones. Other people have a tangible physical sensation. There's no right way, there's no wrong way, including not having any of the above, but just go with your gut and start by building a small collection of things that feels good to you. On the reverse side, I think there's a lot to be learned from crystals that don't feel good to us. They might not be the first ones we want to rush out and buy, though. If you take one look at a strange mineral like camerarite and it makes your stomach feel queasy, you probably need that in your life, but you don't need 15 pounds of it to carry with you through the day, every day. That might be something that you aspire to work with in the right time in a safe and sacred space, but it doesn't need to be your everyday go-to stone. So, find the ones you've got an attraction to. And when people go to metaphysical stores and they're shopping, I tell them to pay attention to two things and two things only.
Yes.
What is it called and how much is it going to cost me?
Okay, so like here's an example of like a couple of ones that I've been attracted to, and I think it's been either the color. I don't even know what these stones are. You can probably rattle these off in your head, but these are all different stones. I don't know if they have this is off of my little jar here of stones, but I was feeling them. I looked at the price because the bigger versions of the stone. So, for example, this one, which is big relative to this one, which is
Right.
smaller, there's a price difference on this. Probably pretty, probably like $4 to $8, or there's a different in price. So that's what you're saying. The look at the price, and what did you say? The what calls you?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's nice to know what your rocks are called. So, take a look at the name. You want to know what you're buying. So I've got an interesting piece of lepidolite here. And then, obviously shop in your budget. That doesn't
Right.
mean we can't aspire to bigger, nicer, higher quality things, but, start with where you're at, whatever that
Yeah.
might
So
be.
if I can't buy the big obelisk, which is usually like a couple $100 at least, um, don't worry about it. It's not like the bigger the
Right.
better, or that, this tiny little stone that's like probably the size of like, a dime is not, a quarter is not going to be as powerful as like the bigger version of this, right? I mean, is that like, don't worry about those things?
I wouldn't worry about those things, especially for personal use. When it comes to size, you're going to hear a lot of people who will, very politely tell you that the size of your crystal doesn't matter. But think of it like this: it's like the size of an antenna or the size of a speaker. All other qualities being the same, where it comes from, the overall shape of it, the saturation of color, the quality of the material itself. If everything else is equal except the size, the bigger one is going to be louder.
Right.
Louder does not equate to better, though. Louder is
Mm.
just louder. If you and I are having an intimate conversation, we can do it in hushed tones and in a whisper. But if I need someone to hear me across the street, I'm probably going to have to shout. So it's the same thing when we kind of work with our crystals. If you're looking for something to carry with you, you don't need a 10-pound sphere to put in your backpack.
Right.
A little tumbled stone you can keep in your pocket is just fine.
Got it. Okay. And then you were talking about stones. Different stones have archetypes and energetic signatures. What does that mean?
So, so far we've talked about things from a very kind of physics and geology based perspective, but if we look at the acculturation of meaning that occurs around all things kind of rock and gem related, there are values that we ascribe, where we either are perceiving qualities and trying to personalize them or personify them in some way, or we're projecting internal qualities that come out when we work with stones. So throughout the eons, we've seen correspondences that connect stones to particular planets and stars and constellations, that connect them to the archetypal elements, the earth, air, fire, and water, and that quintessence, that fifth element that's above and beyond those things. We see connections to specific deities and to specific spirits and stories. And so these are the qualities that are, they hinge upon interaction. There's no piece of hematite that we've got that is necessarily from the planet Mars. but its
Mm-hmm.
iron content. Iron is the planetary metal of Mars in astrological and alchemical traditions. So
Mm-hmm.
any sort of iron-rich mineral, like hematite or magnetite or cedarite, is going to have a sort of Martian energy to it.
Mm.
And so we can call upon the archetypes, the paradigm of Mars. Mars is the god of war. That is a planet that rules things like conflict, but also ambition and movement. And, we can draw the sort of strength of the warrior through stones that are somehow aligned with that.
Mm.
We could also maybe look at a stone that is igneous in origin. Maybe it's a humble piece of granite, a beautiful piece of garnet that's formed by igneous activity, or a nice piece of obsidian. And there's a fiery quality that we find in stones that are born from fire,
Mm.
stones that are created by sedimentary action, where the silts, the sand, the dusts of the earth are
Mm.
carried by the action of water, might instead have a watery kind of
Mm.
quality to them. So we can find correspondences in their energy fields that somehow relate to us in these archetypal paradigms.
Mm.
And looking at the way cultures have valued stones, employed stones, told stories about stones is a reflection of those sort of, those pieces of its energy blueprint.
Mm-hmm. So that like a certain culture. So let me actually go into. I was looking up the stone that I have on. Just to
Yes.
go back to, um, you were talking about birthstones, like you said, like so the
Mm,
birthstone. We're in the month of February. The
right.
birthstone for Aquarius is amethyst. And so in the book, and so in we've actually covered very at a very high level some of the first chapters of the book, and then in the very back of the book has all the different types of stones out there that you'd find at one of these stores. And so here's the one for amethyst. It shows the picture right here. Just to show people the sample of the book. So there's a picture, and then it describes magical uses of amethyst: protection, wisdom, psychic development, healing, purification, curse breaking, and devotion. The elemental signatures, air and spirit. The astrological signature is Venus, Moon, Uranus, Aquarius. The goddess archetype is Maiden, and the formation process is igneous, which you were just mentioning. So, let's say, so I was trying to figure out what stone to put in my
Mm,
mala, and I just thought, I don't know, just put amethyst since it's my birthstone, without thinking about this a lot. But how, like, I've purchased these stones, have a stone for my birth. I'm buying a stone for someone else. Like, how, how would I? So you were talking about this, like this maiden. What does
mm-hmm.
that archetype maiden mean? Um, what are these Venus, Moon, and Uranus elemental? Like,
Mm.
how do I how do I think about these things that you have in your book?
So, in terms of kind of connecting to the fundamental energies of it, if we're working with crystals for like spellcraft or ritual, or even just meditations and hands-on healing, we can look at those sort of correspondences. So,
Mm.
amethyst is often connected to the moon itself, as well as to the sign of Pisces, because we're in I'm sorry, the sign of Aquarius, because
Aquarius,
we're
yeah.
in Aquarius season and it's the birthstone thereof. So we might use those to draw those qualities into our lives. Aquarius is a little bit of the rebel of the zodiac.
Mm-hmm.
Aquarius's ruling planet is Uranus. Uranus spins the wrong way. Its axis is tilted
Uh,
differently from all the other planets in the
yeah.
zodiac. It kind of breaks the norms of things.
Mm.
So a stone that has the qualities of those could help us when we feel the need to break free of limiting circumstances. And that's
Mm.
actually one of the fundamental qualities of amethyst. It helps to highlight and transmute the patterns or processes in our lives that hold us back.
Mm.
Um, the word amethyst comes from Greek amethystine, which means not intoxicated.
Mm-hmm.
And it was thought to prevent inebriation, but in a maybe more metaphorical sense, we can look at it as keeping us from imbibing or indulging in the things that hold us back. And it doesn't have to be a substance. It doesn't
Mm.
have to be keeping you from enjoying your glass of wine. It could be negative self-talk,
Mm.
or chewing your fingernails, or getting angry in traffic, because really it's just traffic. It's there
Right.
anyway.
Right.
And amethyst helps us kind of see where those patterns are and make a conscious choice to transform them.
Right. Okay. And then how do the archetype of a maiden come into this? So
Mm,
so what I'm hearing you say is there's like a there's actually a story behind Amethyst, the stone itself, and that's part of what you said you were attracted to
Right.
when you were younger, to like learn more and more about like the stories about them. But how does this whole maiden aspect work? This whole feminine archetype work?
So in the case of this particular book, a little bit different to my others, it's sort of hyper focus on that lens of the divine feminine, the connection to the sort of sacred female archetypes that we see throughout culture and history. And so with Amethyst in particular, it's kind of connected to a couple of myths that are associated with these sort of maiden archetypes in mythology. So one in particular, which may not be exactly of ancient derivation, but it's the story of the birth of Amethyst through the Greco-Roman pantheon, where we have a nymph by the name of Amethyst who is on her way to the temple of Artemis or Diana, herself a sort of maiden and moon goddess. And along the way, this nymph is, we'll say, made a proposition by a popular god, Bacchus or Dionysus, and she politely passes on his offer, and he won't take no for an answer. So he sets his hounds loose, and we've got a nymph being chased through the woods, and so she calls out to the goddess, even though she's not yet made it to the temple to perform her rites of adoration, to make her offerings. The goddess still intervenes in this. The way she chooses to make her safe is to transform her into quartz, into white crystal. And the retellings of this differ a little bit. In some versions, we see Dionysus or Bacchus enraged, and so he smashes his amphora of wine on the now quartz statue of Amethyst. And in the nicer ones, he's sobered by this. He's seeing that his actions were so extreme, a goddess had to turn this innocent nymph into stone. And so he pours his wine over it in sort of an offering of making peace. And either way, the reddish purple color of the wine stains the crystal and turns it into amethyst. And that's how amethyst was said to be born in the sort of mythological record from this area. And so when we look at these sorts of stories, it gives us clues as to the energy. And so that's why it's linked to that archetype of the maiden, because the nymph herself is a maiden. Nymphs are, divine or semi-divine in their own right. And then we've got her, on her way to connect to and receiving the help from a maiden-like goddess in the form of Artemis or Diana. And so that's why those elements are in this book, because it's focused on the stories of the divine feminine through the lens of the mineral kingdom.
Interesting. Okay, so if I'm not a maiden, I'm more on the crone side at this point. Does Like, why would I be more appropriately wearing a crone mineral, or would it be? It doesn't matter. Like, why would I, as a crone, be wearing a maiden mineral?
So, ultimately, at the end of the day, it's not necessarily about the energies we've got here in our biological makeup, but what is the energy we want to create? So earlier in the book, there's a section that kind of introduces us to these archetypal masks that the divine feminine wears, whether that's maiden or crone or earth mother or, queen of heavens, or the ocean goddess. And so they represent sort of primal forces in nature. And so by connecting to a stone that's linked to that archetype, it's sort of an entryway, an access point to that archetypal force. So any of us could benefit from maiden energy. It's the energy of renewal, of freedom, of liberation, of beauty, of the beginnings of things. And so you might be starting a project and you need that sort of renewal, that generative power we have at the moment of inception of a new project. That's maiden energy. But we also all benefit from that fierce and terrible face of the goddess, who's the protector, who's the destroyer, who's the one who receives us in death, because we have things that we like to wrap up and have nice loose ends tied together so we can move on to the next stage. So, there's sort of an archetype that represents every occasion in life. And when talking about these archetypes of the divine feminine, it's also, I think, helpful to point out that we don't have to be female or female identified or female bodied to access them. Our souls don't know gender. My belief is that we incarnate many times over, and chances are you've run the whole gamut of expressions in that course. And maybe you've even had incarnations that are not human and therefore not limited to this binary that we've had programmed into us. And so stones themselves aren't gendered. The tools we work with are not gendered. And so that's just the language we kind of use to tap into that primal force of, the goddess and the god, the male and the female, the yin and the yang, the dark and the light. But all of us can benefit from the sort of renewal, the replenishment, the transformation that we get from the concept of the divine feminine.
Interesting. So I'm so we're really talking about buying, and the reason why I actually think about this as buying is you're thinking about the express purpose of that stone. There's this kind of what are you naturally pulled to? Like maybe your soul is pulling you there, but then also reading through these and these stories, I can see going the other direction too, reading these stories and looking at what kinds of things that you need in your life as
Mm,
supportive and saying, you know what, I really need an amethyst right now. And then going out and getting those particular stones. I mean, so for example, like one of the things, and maybe you can suggest a stone for me, one of the things that is hard for me, I'm a lot of this already. So air floating all over the earth
mm.
is like my problem. So if I were to get a more grounding stone, give me an example of some grounding stones that you would you could find in jewelry. Like, can you give? I don't know if you can give me an example of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's so many options. You could work with something like many forms of jasper. You could
Mm-hmm.
work with smoky quartz, hematite, tiger's eye. One of my favorite grounding stones is rhodonite. Rhodonite is a manganese mineral. I've got a piece right here. It's usually pink to red, sometimes marbled with these black veins of manganese
Yes.
oxides. But this is particularly grounding to the emotional body, to the heart.
Mm.
Um, but having a grounding stone, especially when we're not maybe pre-programmed to stay really grounded, is
Right.
helpful because we don't always think of grounding as being a necessary part of life. We might think of it as a stage in a ritual or as something that we should do if we have a mental task we have to get on. But if we look at the idea of grounding from an electrical
Mm-hmm.
standpoint,
Mm-hmm.
grounding is the option to complete the circuit.
Mm.
If we have a large appliance that we plug into the walls, at least here in the US, we have 3 prongs in
Mm-hmm.
the outlet, and that third prong is the grounding prong.
Mm-hmm.
So when things are properly grounded, if there's a short, if there's an overload, if there's some sort of malfunction, there's a safe way out for the energy that doesn't belong there. And that
Right.
prevents us from blowing a fuse, so to speak. And
Right.
so energetically, when we are grounded, it's not that we're tied to the ground. It's not that
Mm.
we're unable to fly up into the ethers and do our amazing spiritual work, but it gives us that healthy outlet, that channel that we can direct things that don't serve us. And
Right.
so grounding stones are really a necessary part of the process.
Right. And so in the book, is there a section if I wanted a certain kind of, or would I have to read through? I know in the very back you have all these
Mm-hmm.
different you have the different astrological signs
Mm-hmm.
and you have the different fire, water, spirit, and I guess so. Would I look at the earth? Is there an earth one here?
There will
No.
be, yes.
Okay.
Um,
Okay. So look at the earth one, and then see that would be the grounding. Would that be the grounding stones?
some of those are going to be particularly grounding.
Yeah,
This
Earth. Okay,
this
got it. So there's a whole list of Earth. So that's one way that I would look at this. Um,
Yeah, and as you read through the entries of the individual stones, you'll find that there are going to be many that it talks about their sort of grounding qualities, and
hmm
because these are just stones that relate to the divine feminine as well. There are going to be plenty of grounding crystals that aren't in
Right.
this book. So if the ones in there don't suit you, there are plenty more for
Yeah, and I love. So I particularly love the appendix. So can I draw?
you.
I'm going to show people
Yeah.
what. So one of the things that you have in the back is you have the various goddesses here, and so like I don't know if you have one if you have Paramashiva here, but that's the one that I feel drawn to right now. I don't know, but do you have that Para?
I don't know.
Poverty, though. You have poverty, which is a Hindu. So here's an example of one. It would talk about this is the wife of Shiva, Parvati.
Mm,
So
yeah.
it's Hindu. And then it's mother goddess, consort of Shiva, power, creativity. And then the stones emerald, sapphire, rhod- rhodochrosite, and
Hmm.
pyrite. So I love this. So if you actually have a particular goddess that you're worshiping, you can come here and find the stone. You have of course, the thing that we were just talking about. So I would look at the earth and try to pick out things for more grounding, or if I needed more spiritual lift, maybe air, fire. If I needed to like move forward on something, or water to flow, like these are different things. And then you have different planets on here and different um, you have different you have different signs. So I'm an
Mm.
Aquarius. It has a whole bunch of things beyond amethyst. What are these? What are these supposed to be? These types of stones
Mm.
listed under my sign.
So some of those come from traditional lore. You know, the sort of modern list of gemstones that we see propagated today is created by, we'll say, mutual consensus from jewelers and
Right.
jewelry associations. They are designed intentionally to ensure that colored stones are sold all year round.
Ah.
They're not always based on the lore of the stones themselves. There's some there,
Ah.
but then you'll also find, modern things like tanzanite on the list. There's no ancient lore about tanzanite,
Mm.
but the color is nice, and they want to sell lots of tanzanite, so they assign a value to it. But even from a metaphysical perspective, we have a lot of rocks and minerals that we find today that don't necessarily have counterparts in ancient lore. So we have to sit with those and kind of discover the energies. Sometimes it's based on mineral composition. So, with Venusian signs like Taurus and Libra that are ruled by the planet Venus, Venus in metal form is its planetary metal is copper. So copper
Mm.
rich stones relate to these signs, relate to this planet. Another way that we might look at them is that the color emerald green is typically associated with the sign of Taurus.
Mm.
So gemstones that fall into that color palette might also be associated with it, but then we might also find others that are based on their sort of loving vibrations that we associate with Venus, like rose quartz. Rose quartz is a great stone for either of these signs, but it doesn't contain any copper. It's not especially green in color. In fact, it's rose pink, and yet it's still a very Venusian kind of crystal.
Mm.
So there are lots of ways that we can arrive at those. So what
So,
what you
so
see in
like the
there.
story, like so for when we were talking about amethyst and Aquarius, it's not necessarily. This is like the lore associated with these stones. It's not like Aquariuses are a little bit off center, and so all these stones have that kind of vibrational quality. It's more like these are the stories related that kind of relate to Aquarius. Is that right?
Sometimes both of those things can be true.
Okay.
So it's the list is derived from a lot of different avenues.
Okay, but if like let's say that I was buying a birthday gift for someone who is Aquarius, I could look at this and go like, apparently this is supposed to be good for you, Aquarius person. I know you don't like amethyst, but I'm getting you garnet, and this should be okay. Is that how you would use this one by your sign?
I mean, that's one way to use it. Those signs also represent archetypal forces in our lives.
Mm.
So, I myself am very, very Capricornian. I have 4 planets, including my sun in Capricorn,
Wow.
and
Yeah.
I could benefit from that sort of rebellious, rule-breaking energy that Aquarius offers.
Right.
So even though I'm not an Aquarius, an Aquarian stone could maybe help me shake loose from, that Saturn force that's in my life because of its
Got it.
relationship to Capricorn.
Ah.
So,
Okay.
and when we look at our astrological chart, even before we put the planets and stars in the chart, if we just look at the houses in our chart, all 12 of them span the 12 signs of the zodiac. So we
Right.
have every sign somewhere represented in our
I
chart.
see.
We are all of these energies, but it's how they manifest in our lives.
Right.
So you might have a day when you need more Mars energy. You might have a day when you maybe need a little bit of that Sagittarian, focus and forward thinking and jovial nature.
Right.
So we don't have to be restricted to just the stones of the sign we're born under. We can
Right.
use them for whatever quality is relevant in the here and the now.
This has just been so interesting. We've been talking to Nicholas Pearson, author of Stones of the Goddess Crystals for Divine Feminine, and we've been talking about when you go and buy a stone, how do you choose a stone? There's kind of an intuitive way that you can go, but then there's also like what's the purpose and the energy and the story behind the stone, both of which we covered in the second section. In the third section, we were going to be talking about now you've bought the stone, what to do with those stones.
Mm,
So thank you so much for being on the show.
my pleasure.